Welcome now. Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. I should have listened to the old man at the gas station. His weathered face and trembling hands should have been enough of a warning. But like every other foolish tourist, I dismissed him as just another local trying to scare city folks. Now, as I sit in this broken-down ARV, watching the shadows stretch across the Badlands' bizarre landscape, I realize how terribly wrong I was. "You don't want to take that road, not with winter coming," he had said, his rheumy eyes fixed on my wife and kids waiting in our brand-new Winnebago Vista. "There's other ways to get where you're going." I remember laughing, showing him my GPS and telling him about all the research I'd done about winter camping in the Badlands. He just shook his head and mumbled something in what sounded like Lakota. The first few hours of the drive were exactly what we'd hoped for. The kids were amazed by the otherworldly rock formations, their rust-colored spires reaching up into the steel-gray sky like ancient fingers. Sarah took dozens of photos, and even our usually moody teenager Josh seemed impressed. The weather report had promised light snow, but nothing we couldn't handle in our well-equipped RV. The first sign that something was wrong came when our GPS started acting up. The screen would flicker, showing us in different locations each time it refreshed. I wasn't too concerned. These things happen in remote areas, but then we passed the same distinctive rock formation 3 times, despite driving in what I was certain was a straight line. Sarah noticed it too, but neither of us said anything in front of the kids. The temperature dropped faster than any weather report had predicted. Within an hour, what had started as a gentle snowfall turned into something else entirely. The flakes seemed to fall in unnatural patterns, swirling around our vehicle as if they were being orchestrated by something. The wind carried sounds that made the kids ask questions I couldn't answer, sounds that shouldn't exist in an empty landscape. Just before sunset, we spotted what looked like an ideal camping spot near a cluster of rock formations. As I maneuvered the ARV into position, I could have sworn I saw movement among the rocks. Not animal movement, but something else. Something that made my skin crawl. When I checked again, the rocks were still. But they seemed different. Closer, maybe. Sarah suggested we keep driving, but the growing darkness and deteriorating weather left us with little choice. We had to stop for the night, even as every instinct screamed against it. The night brought a cold unlike anything I'd ever experienced, not the usual winter chill that makes you reach for another blanket, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there. Our RV's heating system, which had worked flawlessly during our test runs back home, started making strange whining noises before giving out completely. I tried calling roadside assistance, but my phone showed no signal. Not even emergency services. Sarah's phone was the same, and our satellite radio picked up nothing but static, with occasional bursts of what sounded like chanting in a language none of us recognized. Josh, usually glued to his gaming devices, reported that none of his electronics would turn on, despite being fully charged just hours ago. Around midnight, the tapping started. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just ice or wind-blown debris hitting the RV's exterior, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. It moved from one side of the vehicle to the other, like something was circling us. When I gathered the courage to look outside with my flashlight, the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating a few feet ahead. Sarah was the first to notice that the rock formations had changed position. I dismissed her concerns initially. After all, rocks don't move. But when little Emma asked why the stone people were getting closer, I felt my blood run cold. The cluster of rocks that had been at least 50 yards away when we parked now loomed just outside our windows, their shapes vaguely humanoid in the moonlight that somehow made the darkness deeper rather than lighter. The RV's engine refused to start when we tried to leave. I spent an hour checking everything I could think of, but nothing was obviously wrong. It just wouldn't turn over. The battery was fine. There was plenty of fuel, but it was as if something was holding the engine back. While I was outside checking the engine again, I heard it, a low rumbling sound coming from the ground itself, like the earth was speaking in a language too ancient for human ears. What happened next made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. As I rushed back into the Arv, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. One of the rock formations, a tall, spindly structure that reminded me of a person reaching toward the sky, had definitely moved. Not fallen, not shifted, but turned, like a person slowly rotating to watch you pass. I slammed the RV door shut behind me, but couldn't shake the feeling that by coming here, we had awakened something that had been waiting a very, very long time. The stone people, as Emma had called them, began moving more freely once they realized we had noticed them. No more pretense of being just rocks, no more subtle shifts when we weren't looking. I watched in horror as one of them uncurled from its crouched position, joints of stone grinding against stone, rising to a height that dwarfed our Arv. Its face was a crude approximation of human features, as if carved by a child with trembling hands. Sarah clutched the children close as more of them rose, surrounding our vehicle. The moonlight caught their rough surfaces, revealing ancient symbols carved into their bodies. Symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. The wind carried their voices now, a sound like granite scraping against granite, forming words that hurt our ears but somehow planted meanings directly into our minds. Offerings, vessels, remain. I remembered the old man's Lakota mumblings now, fragments of a warning I should have heeded. These beings weren't just ancient spirits or cursed entities. They were guardians of something older than human memory, something that slumbered deep beneath the Badlands, and they needed new vessels to continue their eternal watch. The previous vessels, I realized with growing horror, were probably the very rocks we had been admiring earlier. In desperation, I tried the engine again. This time it roared to life, but the sound it made was wrong, wet and organic, like a living thing in pain. The dashboard lights pulsed like a heartbeat, and the GPS screen showed impossible images, maps of places that couldn't exist, coordinates that changed to ancient symbols. Through the windshield, I could see more stone figures emerging from the darkness. Some crawling on all fours, others floating just above the ground. When they began touching the RV, the metal screamed. Their stone fingers left deep grooves that seemed to spread like cracks in ice. Each point of contact causing our vehicle to age decades in seconds. The windows began to crystallize. Transforming into something between glass and mineral, we were watching our shelter, our escape route, being transformed into something ancient and alien. The children's screams snapped me out of my paralysis. Sarah had found the emergency flares in our survival kit, and the bright red light seemed to cause the stone beings physical pain. They recoiled, their movements becoming jerky and uncertain. In that moment of confusion, I stomped on the accelerator. The engine's unnatural roar rose to a fever pitch as we plowed through a gap in their circle. The Arv's frame groaning as crystalline growths spread across its surface. We were mobile, but for how long? And in the rearview mirror, I could see them following, not walking or running, but flowing across the landscape like water down a mountainside. The RV was dying, or perhaps more accurately, transforming. The crystalline growth had spread across most of the exterior, and the dashboard had become a grotesque fusion of modern technology and ancient stone. The GPS screen now displayed only those bizarre symbols, pulsing in rhythm with a deep humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. What terrified me most was how the steering wheel felt warm and almost fleshy under my grip, as if the vehicle was becoming something alive through the increasingly opaque windows. The Badlands had transformed into something impossible. The landscape flowed like liquid, rock formations rising and falling like waves in a petrified ocean. The stone beings pursued us relentlessly, their bodies breaking apart and reforming as they moved, leaving trails of crystalline growth in their wake. The snow that fell around us had turned black, each flake burning small holes in whatever it touched. Sarah discovered the truth first when she found that ancient newspaper clipping that had somehow appeared in Emma's backpack. It was dated 1947, but the paper felt impossibly old, the ink moving across its surface like living things. The article described other disappearances, not just recent ones, but going back centuries, pioneers, Native Americans, modern tourists, all becoming part of the Badlands. The stone beings weren't just capturing people, They were creating more of themselves. Each stone formation in the Badlands had once been someone like us. The revelation came too late. Josh screamed, and I turned to see crystalline growth spreading across his hand where he had touched the window. Sarah tried to pull him away, but the transformation had already begun. His skin took on a granite-like texture, his eyes becoming clouded like quartz. The look of terror on his face began to freeze into an eternal expression of horror. I had to do something, anything, to save my son. That's when the old Lakota words the gas station attendant had muttered came back to me, suddenly making perfect sense. They weren't a warning, they were instructions, a ritual of reversal passed down through generations as Josh's transformation spread past his elbow. I began chanting the phrases, my tongue somehow knowing the ancient words. The stone beings outside froze, their pursuit halted by the sound of their own ancient language. The next few moments were chaos. The Arv's transformation accelerated, the walls closing in as they turned to stone. Sarah pulled Emma through the emergency roof hatch as I continued the chant. My voice growing hoarse, Josh's transformation had stopped at his shoulder, and together we fought through the disintegrating door. Outside, the stone beings had begun to crack, ancient symbols appearing on their surfaces glowing with a fierce red light. We ran through the night, the sound of breaking stone echoing behind us, my voice never stopping the chant despite the pain in my throat. We had to reach the boundary before the transformation completed, the boundary that the old man had marked on our map with shaking hands, though I hadn't understood its significance until now. Dawn was approaching, but the light that began to seep into the sky wasn't the warm glow of sunrise. Instead, it was a sickly mineral sheen that made the air itself look like it was turning to stone. Josh's partially transformed arm had become dead weight, the crystalline surface reflecting impossible colors. Emma hadn't spoken since we escaped the Arv, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the horizon where our vehicle had become just another eerie formation in the Badlands landscape. The boundary the old man had marked was just ahead, a simple line on the map that now glowed with faint phosphorescence on the crumpled paper. Sarah stumbled, and I caught her before she fell, noticing with horror that her feet had begun to crystallize where they touched the ground. We couldn't stop moving. The chant had become automatic now, my throat raw but the words still flowing, holding back the full force of the transformation that threatened to claim us all. Behind us, the stone beings had shattered into thousands of pieces, but each fragment was crawling across the ground like some primitive form of life. Trying to reform, the air was thick with those black snowflakes, each one carrying whispers of the countless others who had been trapped here before us. I could hear their stories now. Pioneers who had strayed from the Oregon Trail, Native American warriors who had faced the entities in ancient times, modern travelers like ourselves who had ignored the warnings. The boundary itself was invisible to normal sight, but we could feel it. The air grew thicker, like wading through syrup, and the ground beneath our feet vibrated with that same deep hum we'd heard in the RV. Josh screamed as we approached it, the first sound he'd made in hours, as his crystallized arm began to crack. The ancient symbols that had spread across his skin started to fade, and pieces of the stone began falling away, revealing raw, human flesh beneath. We broke through the barrier just as the sun finally crested the horizon. The impact felt like being torn apart and reassembled, every molecule of our bodies screaming in protest. Behind us, the crawling stone fragments stopped at the boundary line. Unable to cross, the transformation reversed itself, leaving us whole but forever changed. Josh's arm was human again, but marked with scars in the shape of those ancient symbols. Sarah's feet were flesh once more, though she would walk with a crystalline chime in her steps for the rest of her life. I'm writing this now as a warning, though I know most won't believe it. The old man found us on the road, hours later, somehow knowing exactly where we'd emerge. He helped us document everything, adding our account to a hidden archive of similar stories stretching back generations. Emma still hasn't spoken, but she draws obsessively, endless pictures of figures trapped in stone, their faces frozen in eternal screams. Josh's scars glow faintly at night, pulsing in sync with distant lights we can now see in the Badlands. Sarah says she can hear them sometimes, the voices in the stone calling for new vessels. The Badlands are hungry, always hungry. The stone beings are patient, eternal. They'll wait for the next travelers who ignore the warnings, who dismiss the stories as mere folklore. Our new Winnebago Vista stands as another monument in their gallery of the transformed, a modern sculpture among the ancient spires. If you're reading this, turn back. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled, some campsites should remain empty, and some parts of the Badlands should be left alone to their ancient hunger. Remember, the next formation you admire might have been someone like you who chose to keep driving when they should have turned back. The morning fog clung to the winding roads of Black Hills like a funeral shroud, making our brand new Winnebago. Mini Winnie seemed like a lonely vessel navigating through an ocean of grey. Sarah kept checking her phone, frustrated by the lack of signal, while I focused on keeping our 30-foot home on wheels from drifting too close to the edges of the narrow mountain road. We should have taken the ranger's warning more seriously. Anniversary or not, folks don't come up here during the equinox, he had said, his weathered face twisted with genuine concern. But after driving 12 hours from Chicago, we weren't about to let some local superstition ruin our plans. The Black Hills had been Sarah's dream destination since childhood, and I was determined to make this 5th anniversary special. If I had known then what that decision would cost us, I would have turned around right there. The first real warning came at the small gas station just outside Deadwood. While filling up the RV's massive tank, an elderly Native American woman approached Sarah. I watched through the windshield as she grabbed my wife's arm, her lips moving quickly, urgently. Sarah pulled away, visibly shaken, and hurried back into the RV. She said, "We're going to wake them up." Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She said they've been waiting for someone foolish enough to cross over during the thinning. The GPS died just as we turned onto the unmarked forest road that supposedly led to our campsite. The screen flickered once, displaying a series of coordinates that didn't match our location. Before going completely dark, Sarah tried to restart it, but nothing worked. That's when we noticed the carvings on the trees, crude symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the deepening dusk, though I told myself it was just the reflection of our headlights. Finding the campsite proved easier than expected, though in retrospect, that should have been another red flag. The clearing opened up before us like an invitation, a perfect circle of flat ground surrounded by ancient pines that seemed to lean inward as if they were spectators in some cosmic arena. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves that formed intricate patterns in the dying light. Neither of us mentioned how they seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when we weren't looking directly at them. As I maneuvered the RV into position, the engine suddenly died. The starter clicked uselessly when I tried to restart it. Though we'd just had everything checked before the trip, Sarah suggested we stay put for the night. After all, this was as good a spot as any, I agreed, ignoring the voice in my head screaming that something was terribly wrong. As we began setting up camp, the sun dipped below the horizon with unnatural speed, and the woods around us fell into a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. That's when we heard the first drum beat, so deep and distant it might have been our own hearts pounding in our ears. The first night in our Winnebago turned into a masterclass in primal fear. The drum beats continued, growing neither louder nor softer, maintaining a rhythm that matched our heartbeats with unsettling precision. Sarah tried to convince herself it was just some locals having a party, but we both knew better. In the Black Hills, during the equinox, there were no coincidences. Our RV's electrical system went haywire around midnight. The lights flickered in sequence, from back to front like something was moving through our vehicle. The microwave turned itself on and off, displaying impossible symbols instead of numbers. Our phones, despite being fully charged, drained to empty within minutes. The temperature dropped so rapidly that our breath fogged in front of our faces. Even though the heating system was running at full blast, that's when we first saw them. Shadows moving against shadows, visible only in our peripheral vision. They danced at the edges of our windows, shapes that seemed almost human but too fluid, too tall. Sarah gripped my hand so tight her nails drew blood, but neither of us dared to speak. The drums had stopped, replaced by something worse, a low, melodic humming that seemed to come from the ground itself. I made the mistake of trying to start the ARV again. The engine turned over once, and through the windshield, we saw every tree in the clearing light up from within. As if struck by silent lightning, the symbols carved into their bark blazed with a sickly green light, and in that brief illumination, we saw what the darkness had been hiding. The clearing wasn't natural. The trees formed a perfect circle because they had been planted that way, their trunks twisted into shapes that no natural growth could explain. Sarah screamed when she saw the handprints appearing on our windows, dark, muddy impressions that formed from the inside of the glass. Despite the fact that we could see the clean surface on our side, they were impossibly large, with too many fingers, pressing outward as if something was trying to escape from within the very material of our vehicle. The marks faded after a few seconds, but the message was clear. We weren't alone and we weren't welcome. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but when the sun finally rose, we faced a new horror. The clearing had changed. Our tracks from the previous day were gone, replaced by strange markings in the dirt that spiraled outward from our RAV like the spokes of a wheel. And there, hanging from every branch of every tree surrounding us, were hundreds of small bundles wrapped in bark and tied with hair, each one containing a single weathered human tooth. The morning light brought no comfort to the Black Hills. As Sarah and I frantically gathered our essential belongings, we discovered our phones now only displayed the same strange symbols we'd seen on the microwave. The GPS unit was working again, but it showed us in completely different locations every time we checked. Sometimes in Canada, sometimes in Mexico, as if the very concept of fixed space was breaking down around us. That's when we found the journal. It was tucked into the storage compartment under our bed, though we both swore it hadn't been there when we'd stored our bags. The pages were yellowed, dated 1987, describing another couple's encounter with what we were experiencing. They too had ignored the warnings. Parked in a perfect clearing, heard the drums, the entries became increasingly frantic, describing temporal loops and doorways that shouldn't exist. The final entry simply read, "They're not haunting this place. They are this place." Desperate to escape, I started the ARV. Miraculously, the engine turned over. We pulled out of the clearing, following our tire tracks from the day before. After 20 minutes of driving, we emerged into the same clearing, the same trees, the same bundles hanging from branches, even our original tire tracks leading in. We tried 3 more times, taking different paths. Each attempt led us back to where we started, though the trees seemed closer each time, their twisted trunks now visibly writhing like snakes in slow motion. The true horror began at noon. The sun blinked. For a split second, darkness fell, and in that moment we saw them clearly through the RV's windows. Tall, emaciated figures with too many joints, their skin the color of dried bark, moving with impossible grace between the trees. When light returned, they were gone, but they left behind deep handprints in the metal of our ARV's hull. The metal deformed as if it had been softened by intense heat. Sarah spotted it first, a dark liquid seeping up from the ground. Forming symbols identical to those on the trees, the drums started again, but now we could see their source. The trunks of the trees themselves were pulsing, the bark splitting and healing with each beat, revealing glimpses of something wet and organic beneath. The air filled with whispers in a language that hurt our ears, and the temperature inside the RV began to rise dramatically despite our best efforts with the cooling system. Then we heard the knocking, not on the walls or windows, but from inside the RV's storage compartments. Something was trying to get out. The same compartment where we'd found the journal now bulged outward, the metal creaking under pressure. When we heard what sounded like our own voices calling for help from inside the storage spaces, we knew we had to run. We grabbed our emergency bags and made a break for it. But as we reached for the RV's door handle, we saw our reflections in the window. We were smiling, even though neither of us was actually smiling. Our reflections winked at us, and that's when the real nightmare began. The moment our reflections moved independently, reality itself seemed to splinter. The RV's interior began to twist, the walls breathing like living tissue, and the floor beneath our feet turned soft and pulsing, our reflections in every surface. Windows, mirrors, Even the chrome trim acted out scenes we hadn't performed, showing versions of ourselves doing impossible things. In one window, I watched myself calmly walk through a wall. In another, Sarah was floating near the ceiling, her neck bent at an impossible angle. The journal we'd found began to make terrible sense. Each page now seemed to update itself in real time, showing entries we hadn't seen before, describing the fate of dozens of other travelers who'd been trapped here. Some entries were dated in the future, others seemed to be writing themselves as we watched, describing our current actions with perfect accuracy. When I slammed the journal shut, the words began appearing on our skin instead, crawling across our arms like living tattoos. Sarah figured it out first. "They're not trying to kill us," she whispered, her voice shaking as she stared at the symbols emerging on her skin. "They're trying to make us part of it. The clearing, the trees, the RV, it's all one thing, one organism, and all those other people. They're still here. They never left." As if confirming her words, faces began to emerge from the RV's walls. Distorted, screaming faces we recognized from the photos in the journal. They were alive. Somehow preserved within the material itself, the entity revealed itself then, not as the humanoid figures we'd seen before, but as something far worse. The entire clearing shifted, the ground turning transparent like glass, revealing what lay beneath, a vast, ancient consciousness spread out like roots or synapses, pulsing with bioluminescence. The trees weren't trees at all, but extensions of this thing, sensors or tentacles that reached up into our world. Our ARV had become a part of it too, the metal and plastic now more organic than manufactured. That's when we heard the voice. Not with our ears, but directly in our minds. It spoke in countless voices at once, including our own, explaining through cascading whispers and screams that this place was an intersection point, a place where multiple realities bled together. The entity fed on this convergence, trapping travelers and absorbing them across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each victim became a permanent part of its consciousness, experiencing death and absorption infinitely across endless parallel moments. As if to demonstrate, we watched ourselves die 1,000 different ways in every reflective surface. We saw our bodies twist and merge with the walls, the floor, the earth itself. We saw ourselves run, only to return to this same spot in countless variations. We saw ourselves give in, accept our fate, fight futilely, succeed in escaping, fail horrifically, all happening simultaneously, all equally real. The boundary between what was happening and what could happen completely dissolved. And in that moment, we understood true horror, the realization that linear time and solid reality were comfortable illusions that could be stripped away in an instant. Understanding became our salvation, though the price of that understanding will haunt us forever. The entity had shown us too much, revealed the mechanism of its own existence in its eagerness to break our minds. In showing us all possible realities simultaneously, it inadvertently revealed its weakness. It could only maintain its hold on victims who accepted the reality it presented. Those who had been absorbed were the ones who had tried to fight the corruption of reality itself, who had attempted to deny what they were seeing. Sarah remembered what the Native American woman had said about the thinning during the equinox. This wasn't just about a physical location, it was about a time when the boundaries between realities naturally weakened. The entity didn't create this convergence point. It merely exploited it. And like all natural phenomena, this one had to follow certain rules. The drums, the symbols, the twisted reflections, they were all attempts to make us accept its reality over our own. We did the only thing we could. We rejected everything, not just the horror around us, but our own assumptions about reality. We stopped trying to reconcile what we were seeing with what was possible. When the walls melted, we walked through them as if they were solid. When our reflections tried to reach out and grab us, we ignored them until they lost their power, when the ground became transparent. We treated it as normal Earth. Most importantly, we stopped trying to escape. The entity's influence began to waver. The multiple realities it had shown us started to collapse back into a single timeline. our timeline. The faces in the walls screamed louder. The drums reached a fever pitch, and the symbols on our skin began to burn. But we kept moving, focusing only on what we chose to accept as real. We weren't trying to find our way out anymore. We were simply refusing to participate in the reality it was offering us. The clearing shattered. There's no other way to describe it. Reality itself seemed to splinter and reform. Like pieces of a broken mirror coming back together, when our perception finally stabilized, we were on the main road, inside our RV, which was now completely normal. No organic matter, no living metal, just our familiar vehicle. According to our phones, only 2 hours had passed since we'd first turned onto that unmarked forest road. But we didn't escape unscathed. Our reflections are wrong, not in any way that other people can notice, but we see it. Sometimes they lag behind our movements by a fraction of a second. Sometimes in the corner of our eyes, they're still performing those impossible actions from the clearing. Our phones randomly display those strange symbols before returning to normal. And the words from the journal, they're still there, faintly visible on our skin like old scars, shifting and changing when we're not looking directly at them. This is a warning to anyone planning to go RV camping in the Black Hills. Stay away during the equinox. That thing is still there, waiting in its perfect clearing. We survived because we accidentally stumbled upon the way out, but the entity is learning. It knows now not to reveal too much too quickly. It knows to be more subtle, more patient, and sometimes late at night, we can still hear the drums coming from everywhere and nowhere, reminding us that in some alternate reality, we're still there, becoming part of that ancient, hungry consciousness that lives beneath the twisted trees. I'm writing this, not because I think it will stop people from going there. Warnings never do. But because putting it into words helps convince me that this reality, the one I'm in right now, is the real one. Most of the time, I almost believe it. I should have known better than to ignore the warnings. The ranger at the Death Valley Visitor Center had an odd look in his eyes when I mentioned my plans to camp near Echo Canyon. His weathered face tightened as he stamped my permit, mumbling something about keeping to marked areas and not staying after sunset. I dismissed his concerns. After all, my brand new Airstream Classic was basically a luxury hotel on wheels. The desert stretched endlessly before me as I drove deeper into the park, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rust-colored landscape. My GP started acting strange about an hour in, the screen flickering between my intended route and vast empty spaces that shouldn't exist on any map. I blamed it on the remote location and switched to my backup paper maps, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my stomach. The temperature display in my RV showed 118 degrees outside, but something felt off about the reading. Despite the supposedly extreme heat, I noticed no mirages on the horizon, just an unnaturally still landscape that seemed to be holding its breath. The rental agent had assured me this was the best time to avoid crowds, but I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. The complete isolation should have been my second warning. I found what looked like a perfect camping spot. Just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains, the location wasn't on any of my maps, but it had a level surface and offered a commanding view of the valley below. As I went through the motions of setting up camp, I noticed something strange about the ground. Circular patterns in the sand that looked almost like tire tracks, but they led nowhere and seemed to vanish into solid rock. My RV systems were all green, but the solar panels were generating far less power than they should have been in this intense sunlight. The battery indicator kept fluctuating between full charge and completely dead, even though I'd had everything checked before the trip. When I tried calling the rental company, my satellite phone showed full signal but couldn't connect. I told myself it was just typical desert interference. That's when I heard it. A low, pulsing hum coming from somewhere in the canyon below. It was barely audible at first, more felt than heard, like the bass at a distant concert. But there was something wrong about the rhythm, something that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. I checked my watch, 7:43 p.m. The sun hadn't quite set, but darkness was already gathering in impossible ways around my campsite. I should have left right then. I should have never stayed. The problem started small. A flicker of the lights, a stutter in the air conditioning. I kept telling myself it was just the desert playing tricks on my expensive RV, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The digital display on my control panel started showing impossible readings. Outside temperature dropping to 50 degrees in Death Valley, altitude readings of 9,000 feet when I was clearly in a valley, and battery levels that somehow exceeded 300%. That humming sound never stopped. If anything, it grew stronger as night fell completely. The darkness out here was different. It seemed to press against the windows of my RV like a living thing, seeping through tiny gaps I hadn't noticed before. My phone now showed no service despite the satellite connection, and the radio picked up nothing but static, occasionally broken by what sounded like whispered words in a language I couldn't understand. I tried starting the engine around midnight, hoping to drive back to civilization, but the ARV's electronic systems had completely lost their minds. The GPS screen showed me simultaneously in Death Valley and somewhere in the Arctic Circle. The engine management system reported critical failures in parts that didn't exist, and the backup camera displayed only static, with occasional glimpses of something moving in the darkness behind my vehicle. The circular patterns I'd noticed in the sand earlier had changed. I'm certain of it when I shined my flashlight through the window. They seemed to have shifted position, forming new configurations that made my head hurt when I tried to understand their geometry. The beam of my flashlight didn't penetrate the darkness like it should have. Instead, it seemed to bend and distort, as if the very physics of light worked differently here. That's when I noticed the other tire tracks, fresh ones, appearing in the sand around my RV. Even though I hadn't heard any vehicles, they formed perfect circles, overlapping and intersecting in patterns that couldn't have been made by any normal vehicle, and in the center of each circle, the sand looked crystallized, as if it had been subjected to intense heat or pressure that shouldn't be possible in nature. The air inside the RV grew thick and heavy, carrying a metallic taste that made my mouth go dry. The temperature kept dropping despite my heater running at full blast, and frost started forming on the inside of my windows. Frost that seemed to arrange itself into complex patterns that looked disturbingly like faces when viewed from the corner of my eye. I huddled in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself I could wait until morning, even as I realized I no longer knew how long that wait would be. I'm still not sure if what I saw first was a hallucination or reality. A figure standing just at the edge of my RV's exterior lights, perfectly still, wearing what looked like an old park ranger uniform. When I blinked, they were gone, but something had been left behind, a worn leather logbook, its pages filled with frantic entries dating back to the 1970s, all describing similar experiences, different vehicles, different decades, but always the same circular patterns, the same electrical failures, the same whispers in the dark. The logbook's final entry was dated just 3 weeks ago. They're not taking us to study us, they're taking us to feed it. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, ending in a violent scrawl that trailed off the page. That's when I noticed something else. Photographs tucked into the back cover, showing other RVs and vehicles in this exact same spot, spanning decades. In every photo, those same circular patterns surrounded the vehicles, and in each one, they were slightly closer to the center. My attempt to drive away failed spectacularly. The engine roared to life, but the wheels spun uselessly. Even though the ground was perfectly solid, the GPS screen exploded in a shower of sparks, and through the smoke, I saw new coordinates appearing on the shattered display. Numbers that couldn't exist on Earth, changing faster than I could read them. The radio burst into life, playing fragments of distress calls that I now realized had been recorded in this very spot over the past 50 years. The circular patterns were definitely moving now, spiraling inward like a gigantic fingerprint being drawn in the sand. The humming had become a physical force, vibrating through the RV's frame with enough intensity to shatter my drinking glass. Through the fragments, I watched in horror as the water inside formed identical circular patterns before evaporating instantly. The temperature inside the RV plummeted to the point where my breath came out as crystalline patterns that hung in the air instead of dissipating. That's when I saw them through the freezing windows. Other vehicles, dozens of them, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the darkness. Cars, trucks, RVs from every decade, all caught in the same spiral pattern. Some looked crashed, others perfectly preserved, but all were empty. In their windshields I caught reflections of people pounding silently on the glass, their faces contorted in endless screams. The logbook's pages began turning on their own, revealing names and dates that matched each vehicle's appearance. The truth hit me with devastating clarity. This wasn't just a campsite, it was a trap, refined over decades to attract travelers like me. Each victim's experience had been recorded, studied, and used to perfect the lure. The ranger at the visitor center hadn't been trying to warn me away. He'd been marking me as the next target. As this realization sank in, the circular patterns in the sand began to glow with an intense, otherworldly light, and I felt my arms start to sink, not into the ground, but into something else entirely. The world outside my arms ceased to make any physical sense. The desert landscape twisted into impossible geometries, the mountains bending and folding like paper in ways that made my mind scream. The circular patterns had become a massive spiral of glowing energy, and at its center, I could see something emerging. A void that wasn't just darkness, but the complete absence of reality itself. My Arv was being pulled toward it, the metal groaning as space itself warped around us. Through the distorted windows, I watched in horror as other vehicles began emerging from the void. Not as ghosts this time, but as physical wreckage being regurgitated from whatever dimension had claimed them. A 1950s Airstream, crushed like a tin can, shot past my window, its metal skin covered in symbols that matched the patterns in the sand. A modern Tesla followed, its electronics still frantically flashing, displaying the same impossible coordinates I'd seen earlier. Each vehicle bore the marks of what had taken them, perfect circular indentations. As if reality itself had tried to fold them into another dimension, the logbook started vibrating on my table, its pages flipping rapidly before stopping on a hand-drawn diagram. The crude sketch showed the circular patterns, but with annotations in multiple handwritings, decades of victims working together, passing down information. Some notes were in languages I didn't recognize, others in mathematical formulas that hurt to look at, but one message was repeated over and over. The patterns are a frequency, match it to disrupt. That's when I realized the humming wasn't just a sound, it was a key in my desperation. I did something that seemed insane. I started tuning every electronic device in my RV to create feedback. The radio, the engine's electronic systems, even the microwave, anything that could generate a signal. The cacophony was deafening. But as the frequencies overlapped, I noticed the circular patterns in the sand flickering. Like a digital image losing signal, the void at the center of the spiral pulsed erratically, and for a moment I saw through it, saw the true form of what had been hunting here for decades. It was vast beyond comprehension, a being of pure geometry and impossible mathematics. Where it intersected with our reality, space itself buckled and twisted. I saw how it had been using our vehicles as anchors, creating a web of technology-based frequencies to widen its gateway into our world. Each victim had provided more data, more frequencies, more ways to manipulate our reality. The ranger's uniform I'd seen wasn't worn by a ghost. It was a lure, a constructed memory pulled from the minds of countless trapped victims. The entity reacted to my disruption with immediate violence. The air itself began to crystallize, forming those same circular patterns in 3 dimensions now, trying to encode my Arv's structure into its mathematical language. Through the freezing windows, I could see other victims reaching out from their temporal prisons, some pointing urgently at something beyond the spiral. As my Arv's frame began to twist and fold, I realized I had only moments to act. Either I would find a way to break free from its pattern, or I would become another coordinate in its vast calculation. The frequencies I had created weren't just disrupting the entity's patterns, they were tearing apart the barrier between dimensions. Through the crystallizing air, I saw the other victims becoming more solid, their trapped vehicles phasing between existence and non-existence, The void at the center of the spiral began to fluctuate wildly, and in that chaos, I saw my chance. I pushed every system in my eye to its limit, creating a discordant symphony of electronic noise that made reality itself shudder. The entity's response was immediate and terrifying. The desert itself seemed to come alive, the sand rising in towering spirals of geometric patterns. My Arv's metal skin began to fold inward, creating those same circular patterns that had marked every other victim. But something was different. The overlapping frequencies had created a weakness in its mathematical prison. Through my distorting windshield, I saw other trapped victims pointing to a gap in the patterns, a split-second break in its perfect calculation. In that moment of clarity, I did the only thing I could. I floored the accelerator. The engine screamed in protest as space warped around us. But the wheels finally found purchase on something that wasn't quite sand anymore. We shot forward, the RV's frame groaning as multiple realities tried to claim it. Behind us, the void collapsed in on itself, releasing a burst of energy that shattered every piece of glass in my vehicle. The last thing I saw in my broken mirrors was decades of trapped vehicles falling back into normal space, their metal frames twisted into impossible shapes. The escape wasn't clean. Half of my RV seems to exist in a slightly different dimension now. The metal ripples when you look at it directly, and none of the electronic systems will stay stable for more than a few hours. The circular patterns branded themselves into my retinas. I see them overlaid on everything I look at, pulsing in time with a frequency I can still feel in my bones. The logbook survived, but its pages are blank now, as if everything written there has been pulled back into that other dimension. I made it back to the ranger station just as dawn broke, though my dashboard showed that 3 days had passed in what felt like hours. The ranger who had stamped my permit was gone. In fact, according to the staff there, no ranger matching that description had worked at Death Valley for the past 50 years. When I showed them my permit, the paper crumbled to dust, leaving behind only a faint impression of those same circular patterns. This is my warning to anyone thinking about RV camping in Death Valley. That thing is still out there, still searching for new frequencies, new technologies to add to its eternal calculation. It's learning, adapting, using our own innovations against us. Those circular patterns appear in my nightmares now, trying to pull me back. Sometimes my phone displays coordinates that don't exist on any map, and I hear that humming in the static between radio stations. If you see a ranger with an odd look in their eyes, if you find a spot that seems perfect but isn't on any map, if you notice circular patterns in the sand, run. Don't follow your GPS. Don't trust your instruments. Just run, because once those patterns start forming around you, you're already part of its equation. The bitter January wind howled through the Great Smoky Mountains as I pulled my Thor motor coach into the nearly empty visitor center parking lot. I'd been reeve camping for over a decade, but something felt different about this trip from the moment I arrived. The ranger at the entrance station had given me an odd look when I mentioned my plans to stay deep in the park's winter camping area. Old Tom's General Store was my last stop before heading to my campsite, and the elderly owner's reaction when I mentioned my destination still haunts me. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he stocked the shelves, telling me how the Cherokee elders refused to visit that part of the mountains during winter. I dismissed his concerns as local superstition, a decision I would soon regretfully regret with every fiber of my being. The road grew narrower as I drove deeper into the park, ancient trees looming overhead like silent sentinels guarding forbidden territory. My Reeves GP started glitching, the screen flickering between destinations as if confused by some unseen interference. The modern technology I relied on was already beginning to fail, though I didn't recognize the warning signs for what they were. Strange symbols carved into the trees began appearing along the roadside, their crude forms barely visible through the growing snowfall. I initially blamed it on local teenagers or perhaps trail markers, but their increasing frequency and ancient appearance sent chills down my spine. The growing darkness seemed to make them glow with a faint, phosphorescent light that couldn't be natural. The temperature dropped drastically as I finally reached the winter camping area, far below what the weather report had predicted. My RV's external thermometer malfunctioned, cycling through impossible readings before settling on a steady display of 13 degrees. The complete absence of other campers should have been my final warning, but I was too focused on setting up camp before complete darkness fell. As I prepared for my first night in the mountains, a distant chorus of what sounded like wooden flutes echoed through the valleys. The haunting melody seemed to come from all directions at once, carried on the wind like whispered warnings in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow filled me with an instinctive dread. If only I had listened to those warnings. If only I had left when I still had the chance. My first indication that something was terribly wrong came at exactly 3:33 a.m., when every electronic device in my RV suddenly sprang to life. The microwave hummed with phantom power, the TV flickered through static channels, and my phone screen displayed an endless stream of Cherokee symbols I'd later recognize from the trees. Everything shut down just as abruptly, plunging me into a darkness deeper than any I'd experienced before. The temperature inside the RV plummeted rapidly, my breath forming thick clouds in the beam of my flashlight. I tried starting the engine to run the heater, but the sophisticated systems of my Thor motor coach were completely unresponsive. The modern convenience I'd relied on had transformed into a metal cage, trapping me in the growing cold that seemed to carry whispers with every Arctic blast. Morning refused to arrive, the darkness stretching well beyond when dawn should have broken. My watch insisted it was 9 a.m., but the sky remained an impenetrable void, broken only by occasional glimpses of strange lights dancing between the trees. The snow had piled up silently during the night, creating a pristine white barrier that reflected the unnatural darkness above. Attempting to call for help proved futile. My satellite phone displayed full signal, but every call connected to the same sound. That haunting wooden flute melody from the previous evening, now accompanied by rhythmic drumming that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. Each failed attempt to reach the outside world only emphasized how completely cut off I'd become from civilization. The isolation began to play tricks with my mind, or at least that's what I desperately tried to tell myself. Shadows moved against the darkness outside my windows, taking forms that seemed vaguely human but wrong in ways my brain refused to process. The snow around my RV remained unmarked, yet I could hear footsteps circling the vehicle, growing closer with each pass. Inside the RV, condensation began forming strange patterns on the windows, not the random designs of frozen water, but deliberate symbols matching those I'd seen carved into the trees. As I watched in horror, they seemed to write themselves into the frost, each new symbol accompanied by a deep vibration that shook through the entire vehicle like the beating of an ancient drum. The first direct encounter came when something started scratching at my RV's roof. Not the familiar sound of branches in the wind, but deliberate, methodical patterns that matched the rhythm of those ethereal drums. The metal groaned under pressure from above, denting inward as if something impossibly heavy was trying to force its way through. My sanctuary was becoming my prison. Ancient Cherokee legends spoke of winter spirits that hunted in these mountains, but what circled my RV now seemed far older and more malevolent than any folklore could describe. Through the frosted windows, I caught glimpses of towering figures moving through the endless night, their forms shifting between human and animal shapes with impossible fluidity. Their movements left no tracks in the snow, yet the ground trembled with each step. My desperate attempt to escape was thwarted when the RV's door froze shut, the metal itself crystallizing with patterns of frost that spread like living things. The temperature inside had dropped so low that my skin stuck to any metal surface I touched, and the water in my bottles had frozen solid, despite the propane heater running at full blast. The cold felt alive, hunting me within my own vehicle. The entities outside began their assault in earnest, pounding on every surface of the RV in a synchronized rhythm that made my skull vibrate. The windows darkened with layer upon layer of those mysterious symbols, now glowing with an inner light that pulsed in time with the impacts. Each flash revealed more of the creature's true forms in silhouette, forms that defied sanity and natural law. A thunderous impact rocked the entire Arv, shattering one of the smaller windows and letting in a blast of Arctic air that carried the overpowering scent of pine needles and decay. Through the broken window came a sound that still haunts my nightmares. Not quite speech, not quite song, but something ancient and full of malice that made my bones ache just from hearing it. The sound carried images with it, visions of this place throughout centuries of winters. In those visions, I saw other travelers who had ignored the warnings, other vehicles swallowed by the endless dark. I witnessed how the entities had claimed them, one by one, adding their essence to the ancient hunger that dwelled in these mountains. As the visions faded, I knew with terrifying certainty that I was meant to be next, unless I could find a way to escape before the entities breached my failing shelter. The Arv's metal frame screamed in protest as supernatural forces tore at it from all directions, the walls buckling inward like paper in invisible hands. I retreated to the bathroom, the smallest and most central space in the vehicle, clutching my last functioning flashlight and a Celtic cross I'd bought years ago at a flea market. To my shock, the ancient symbols seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, causing the pounding on the walls to momentarily retreat. Understanding crashed over me like a wave of ice water. These entities, whatever they were, responded to old symbols and beliefs, the Cherokee warnings, the carved trees, the frost patterns. They weren't just markers, they were wards. Frantically, I began copying the symbols I'd seen onto every surface I could reach. Using anything that would leave a mark, the entity's assault intensified with each symbol I drew, their fury at my resistance manifesting in ear-splitting shrieks through the cacophony of supernatural violence. I heard something that chilled me even more than the Arctic air, the distinct sound of other voices, human voices calling for help from the darkness outside. They begged to be let in, using the names and voices of loved ones I knew couldn't possibly be here. The entities were trying to trick me, attempting to prey on my desperate need for human contact after hours of isolation. The bathroom mirror shattered spontaneously, and in the fragments I caught glimpses of what was really outside. Creatures that seemed to be made of shadow and ice, their forms constantly shifting between human shapes and something far more primordial. Their eyes glowed with the same phosphorescent light I'd seen in the tree carvings, and they moved with a fluidity that defied physics. The Celtic cross pulsed brighter in response to their revealed forms. In that moment of revelation, I understood the true nature of my predicament. These weren't simply malevolent spirits, but guardians of some ancient boundary that modern humanity had forgotten. My Arv, with all its technology and artificial comfort, was an invasion of their domain. The realization came with a price. The entities sensed my understanding and redoubled their efforts to break in, determined to ensure this knowledge would die with me. A massive impact split the RV's roof open like a tin can, letting in a torrent of supernaturally cold air and swirling snow. Through the breach I could see dozens of those phosphorescent eyes peering down, and behind them, impossibly, a void darker than the night sky. As they began to pour in through the opening, I knew I had only moments to attempt my final, desperate plan for survival. Clutching the Celtic cross in one hand and my flashlight in the other, I made a desperate break for the RV's emergency exit, reciting every prayer and protection chant I could remember. The entities surged after me, their forms coalescing into a wave of living darkness that froze everything it touched. The cross flared with brilliant light, creating a narrow path through their midst that I knew wouldn't last long. The bitter mountain air hit me like a physical blow as I plunged into the snow, my boots breaking through ice crust thick enough to support my weight. Behind me, the Arv groaned one final time before imploding with a thunderous crack. Crushed by forces beyond human comprehension, the destruction sent a shockwave of supernatural energy across the clearing that knocked me face first into the deep snow, temporarily disorienting the pursuing entities. Every survival instinct screamed at me to stay still and hidden, but I knew that would mean death in this killing cold. I forced myself up and started running, using the Celtic cross like a compass. Its glow intensified whenever I moved away from the entity's influence. The darkness around me was alive with movement. shadows darting between trees and those horrible flute melodies echoing from every direction, trying to disorient and confuse me. Dawn finally broke after what felt like hours of desperate flight, though it brought little warmth to the frozen landscape. The entity's pursuit weakened with the growing light, their forms becoming less substantial. But I didn't slow down. My legs burned with exhaustion, my lungs raw from the frigid air, but the memory of what I'd witnessed drove me forward. The cross's glow had faded to almost nothing, telling me I'd finally reached the boundary of their territory. 3 days later, search and rescue found me huddled in the back of Old Tom's General Store, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. The authorities never found my ARV. The GPS coordinates I gave them led to an empty clearing with no sign that any vehicle had ever been there. The only evidence of my ordeal was a series of photographs on my partially frozen phone, showing those strange symbols in the frost, though most claimed they were just random ice patterns. I'm sharing this story now as a warning to others who might dismiss local legends and ancient warnings as mere superstition. There are places in this world where the old boundaries still hold, where modern conveniences and technology mean nothing in the face of powers that have watched over the land since time immemorial. If you value your life, never take your RAV to the Great Smoky Mountains in winter. Some territories aren't meant for casual tourism, and some warnings are written in blood and bone rather than travel guides. My camera lens frosted over for the third time as I tried to capture the sunset over Lake Powell. Standing outside my rented Airstream, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the photos. Not just technically wrong, but fundamentally disturbing in a way I couldn't explain. The winter air bit through my jacket as I reviewed the images on my camera's display. Each shot of the frozen lake looked slightly different from what I remembered seeing through the viewfinder. The rental agent in Page had tried to talk me out of this trip. Miss Chen, winter camping at Lake Powell isn't like your California photo shoots, he'd warned, his weathered face creasing with concern. The Navajo say the lake gets hungry when it freezes. I'd laughed it off, showing him my impressive portfolio and extensive camping experience. Now, as the sun dipped below the crimson cliffs, his words echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Setting up the Airstream had been surprisingly difficult. Despite being a 2024 model with state-of-the-art systems, the leveling jacks had malfunctioned twice, and the GPS kept insisting I was half a mile into the lake itself. I'd chosen this specific spot for its isolation, a private alcove with a perfect view of the lake and cliffs. 4 days of solitude to capture the winter beauty of the Southwest. No cell service, but I had a satellite phone for emergencies. As darkness crept in, I noticed something odd about my tire tracks in the thin layer of snow. They seemed to lead in a different direction than the path I remembered taking. The realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. I quickly retreated into the Airstream, securing the door behind me. The elegant interior, all brushed aluminum and modern conveniences, offered little comfort as I reviewed my photos on the laptop. The first few shots were normal, stark winter landscapes in perfect composition. But as I progressed through the sequence, something began to change. In each subsequent image, the ice on the lake appeared to hold a different pattern, like a vast fingerprint slowly pressing upward from beneath the frozen surface. In the last photo, taken just before sunset, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure standing on the ice. Too far to make out clearly, but definitely not there when I took the picture. Trying to rationalize, I blamed it on shadows or digital artifacts. But when I heard the first scratch against the Airstream's exterior, a long, deliberate sound like nails on aluminum, I knew the rental agent's warning hadn't been just local superstition. The scratch came again, followed by a sound I'll never forget. The distinct crackle of ice spreading across my windows, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like watching eyes. That was my first night at Lake Powell. I should have left immediately, should have trusted the warning signs, but I convinced myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was just playing tricks on my mind. Looking back now, I realize those first hours were my last chance to escape. The thing beneath the ice was already watching, already planning, and I, armed with nothing but an expensive camera and misplaced confidence, had unknowingly stumbled into its hunting grounds. I woke to the sound of my own breath freezing in the air. The Airstream's heating system had failed sometime during the night, and the interior temperature had plummeted well below freezing. My phone's display showed an impossible 40 degrees. Impossible because Lake Powell never gets that cold, even in the depths of winter. The real temperature couldn't have been below 20 degrees, but every digital device in the RV disagreed. Condensation had frozen in strange, angular patterns across the windows, forming what looked like ancient symbols. I recognized some of them from the Navajo petroglyphs I'd photographed yesterday, but these seemed to twist and change when viewed from different angles. The morning sun should have been visible through the eastern window, but outside was nothing but a gray, impenetrable mist. The satellite phone was dead, not just battery dead, but completely unresponsive. Its screen cracked in a pattern that mirrored the ice on the windows. I tried the Airstream's engine. It turned over but wouldn't catch, each attempt producing a sound more like breaking ice than a failing engine. The modern touchscreen control panel that managed all the RV's systems displayed nothing but static, occasionally resolving into what looked like faces in the noise. My camera was the only electronic device still working, though each photo I took showed something different from what I saw through the viewfinder, where my eyes saw empty shoreline. The camera captured dark shapes moving through the mist. The ice on the lake had changed overnight, forming concentric circles around a central point about 100 yards from shore. The patterns were too perfect to be natural. I tried to radio for help, but instead of static or emergency channels, I heard something that made me question my sanity. Beneath the white noise was a voice speaking in what sounded like Navajo, but played backwards and underwater. It repeated the same phrase over and over, growing clearer with each iteration. Though I didn't understand the language, the meaning somehow formed in my mind. The cold ones are hungry. Around noon, I heard engines in the distance, other vehicles on the main road. I grabbed my coat and emergency pack, ready to hike out and flag them down. But as I stepped outside, the sound changed. What I thought were engines was actually the ice groaning. The whole lake surface shifting like something massive was moving beneath it. The concentric circles had grown closer to shore, and the fog had drawn in tighter around my rye. The Airstream's external cameras caught movement that wasn't there. Dark figures darting between the rocks. Always just out of direct sight, the footage showed me standing outside much longer than I actually had, and in places I hadn't been. In one frame, there was even a second version of me, standing on the ice and waving back at the RV. I checked the timestamp. It was from 10 minutes in the future. That's when the scratching started again, but this time it came from inside the walls. Something was moving through the Airstream's infrastructure, like it had infected the very systems designed to keep me safe. The temperature dropped even further, and ice began forming on the inside of the walls, creating those same twisted symbols. As night fell, I realized the truth. The RV wasn't just failing, it was being transformed into something else, something that wanted to drive me out onto the ice. The cameras started clicking by themselves at midnight. Each flash illuminated something different, fragments of a reality that shouldn't exist. In one photo, the Airstream's interior was decades older, rust-eaten and abandoned. In another, ice formations had completely taken over, transforming the space into a crystalline cave. But it was the third photo that made me scramble for the door. It showed me, frozen solid, sitting in the exact spot where I was currently standing. I had to get out. The RV had become a trap, its metal walls groaning as they bent inward from impossible angles. The door refused to open at first, not frozen shut but actively resisting, until I noticed it was waiting for me to pull instead of push, even though it was definitely a push door. The moment I stepped outside, I understood the rental agent's cryptic warning about the lake's hunger. The ice had reached the shore now, forming a perfectly smooth path from my RV to the center of those concentric circles. The fog had lifted, revealing a night sky devoid of stars. as if something had swallowed them. My camera, still taking photos autonomously, captured what my eyes couldn't. Massive shapes moving under the ice, their forms suggesting something between fish and human, but wrong in ways I couldn't process. A figure stood at the center of the ice circles, the same dark silhouette from my first photos. Through my camera's viewfinder, I could see it more clearly. It wore what looked like ancient Navajo ceremonial dress, but made entirely of ice and shadow. As I watched, it raised an arm and pointed at something behind me. I spun around to find my own reflection in the airstream's metallic surface. But it wasn't moving when I did. The temperature dropped so low that the air itself began to crystallize. My camera's screen showed the impossible. Hundreds of previous visitors, their RVs and cars trapped in the ice below the surface, preserved in a perfect moment of realization, the moment they understood what had lured them here. Some of the vehicles were decades old, others looked newer than my airstream. All of them had been gradually absorbed into the lake's frozen matrix. That's when I heard it, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in frequencies that made my teeth vibrate. "Your kind always returns," it said, using sounds that ice makes when it breaks. "Each winter, bringing your metal shelters, your electronic eyes, thinking they protect you, they only make you easier to attract, easier to preserve." The entity began to move toward shore, each step creating new ice patterns that spread like cracks in glass. My camera revealed the truth about its movement. It wasn't walking on the ice. It was emerging from it, building itself from frozen layers like a 3D printer working in reverse. The dark spaces between its ice crystal layers showed more preserved victims, their faces pressed against their final prison. Mouthing warnings I couldn't hear, I ran back to the airstream, but the door now opened into a solid wall of ice. My reflection in its surface smiled at me with too many teeth, then reached out through the metal. The satellite phone in my pocket came back to life, not to rescue me, but to show coordinates of other frozen travelers beneath the surface. The entity was close now, bringing with it the accumulated cold of countless winters, offering me a place in its frozen collection. The realization hit me as I stared at my camera's display. The entity never appeared the same way twice in photos, but it always reacted to the flash. Each burst of light made it recoil, its ice crystal form momentarily destabilizing. This wasn't just about documenting the horror anymore. My camera might be the only thing keeping me alive. The airstream had become a frozen nightmare, its walls now transparent ice showing layers of previous travelers' belongings suspended within. Old cameras, phones, camping gear, all preserved in perfect clarity. But it was what I saw through my own camera's viewfinder that changed everything. The LCD screen revealed writing in the ice, messages left by previous photographers who had discovered what I was learning now. "Light breaks the illusion," one message read, carved into a frozen camera strap. "It's not the cold that freezes, it's the dark." Another message, this one etched into an ancient film canister. "They feed on the absence of light." The entity had been collecting photographers for decades, but some had figured out its weakness. My camera's sensor could see what human eyes couldn't. The creature was hollow, a void wrapped in ice, and light passed straight through it. It came at me faster now, desperate to stop my discovery. The air crystallized with each movement, forming layers of ice that tried to trap me in place. Through my viewfinder, I could see its true form shifting between the ice crystals. Not a solid being, but a collection of frozen moments, each layer containing fragments of its previous victims' last seconds. This thing wasn't just preserving people, it was freezing time itself. My camera's battery was dying, each flash weaker than the last. The entity knew this, its form growing more solid as my power source faded. That's when I remembered my photography kit in the RV, specifically the high-powered external flash units I used for night shooting. But getting to them meant going back inside the airstream, which had become part of the entity's frozen domain. The ice was closing in, forming a perfect circle around me, just like the patterns on the lake. My breath no longer frosted in the air. It crystallized instantly, forming tiny mirrors that reflected fragments of other winters. other victims. Through my camera, I watched as the entity began to merge these fragments, creating a window through time to all its previous hunts. It was showing me my future, frozen forever in its collection. But there was something else in those reflections, something the creature didn't want me to see. Every photographer it had taken had died with a camera in their hands, and every camera had fired one last time. The combined power of decades of final flashes had been building inside the ice. Waiting for someone to understand, I didn't just need my flash units. I needed to find a way to trigger every frozen camera trapped in the ice. All at once, the frozen walls of the airstream had become transparent enough to see my photography equipment suspended within. Each piece was perfectly preserved, like insects in amber, but reaching them meant breaking through layers of ice that contained decades of frozen memories. My hands were bleeding from the attempts, but I'd managed to retrieve 2 high-powered flash units and an old manual camera that still had its flashbulb intact. Through my camera's viewfinder, I could see something extraordinary. All the frozen cameras in the ice were still operational, their ancient batteries preserved in the perfect cold. Decades of equipment, from antique plate cameras to modern DSLRs, all trapped at the moment of their final shot. The entity hadn't just been collecting photographers. It had been collecting our tools, our technology, our ways of seeing. The creature was everywhere now, its form rippling through the ice like northern lights made solid. The temperature had dropped so low that the entire world seemed to be turning to crystal. But in that impossible cold, I saw the pattern. Each camera in the ice was pointed toward the center of the lake, toward that first circle where I'd seen the figure standing. They had all died trying to capture its true form, but together they had created something the entity couldn't escape. My fingers were nearly useless from frostbite, but I managed to wire the flash units together. The entity watched. Curious perhaps, or confident in its power, through my viewfinder, I saw its true face for the first time. A void in reality, a place where light and time went to freeze. It had been patient, collecting photographers because we were the only ones who could see fragments of its real nature. It wanted to be seen. Even as it destroyed those who saw it, the trap was a perfect circle of ice, just like the one it had created to catch me. But this circle was made of frozen cameras, all connected by impossibly preserved wiring, all pointing inward as I connected the last wire to my own camera. I understood the messages left by those who came before. We couldn't fight this thing with warmth or force. We had to fight it with its own weapon, preserved moments of time. Light breaks the illusion, I whispered, quoting the frozen message as I stepped into the circle. The entity followed, compelled by the pattern it had used so many times before. Through every frozen lens, I could see fragments of its true form, each camera capturing a different layer of its impossible geometry. My hands found the trigger wire just as the ice began to climb up my legs. The flash that followed was like a new sun being born. Every camera trapped in the ice fired simultaneously. Decades of preserved power releasing in a single burst of pure light. The entity screamed in frequencies that shattered its own ice, its form caught between hundreds of lenses, each flash freezing a different piece of its existence. It had spent winters collecting frozen moments, and now those moments were turning against it. The ice exploded outward, taking the entity with it. The force threw me back toward the shore as the frozen lake began to break apart. Through my battered camera, I caught one final image. The creature scattered across time and space, each piece trapped in a different photo, imprisoned by the very technology it had tried to collect. The airstream was a wreck, but its engine finally turned over. I drove for hours without stopping, my hands wrapped in torn clothing, the camera's final image burning on its display. The entity wasn't dead. You can't kill something that exists outside of time, but it was trapped now, scattered across thousands of photos buried in the ice. As I crossed the Arizona state line, my frostbitten fingers typed out this warning: never go RV camping at Lake Powell in winter. And if you're a photographer, stay far away. Some things should remain unseen, and some photographs should never be developed. I should have listened to that park ranger's trembling voice when he handed me my camping permit. There was something off about the way he kept glancing at the setting sun, as if counting down the minutes until he could leave his post. The autumn air at Yellowstone carried an unusual chill that afternoon, making me grateful for the comfort of my newly purchased Winnebago Vista. I'd saved for months to afford this RV, dreaming about the perfect off-season trip when the crowds would thin out and I could truly experience the raw beauty of the park. The ranger's warning about avoiding certain unmarked areas seemed excessive at the time, especially since my permit clearly showed I was sticking to designated camping zones. Looking back now, I realize he was trying to save my life without breaking whatever code of silence they must follow. The first signs that something was wrong came as I drove deeper into the park. My RV's GPS started glitching, showing impossible coordinates and recalculating routes that led nowhere. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating dark patches that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. The usually reliable Keeb radio picked up nothing but static, occasionally broken by what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't identify. A few other RVs passed me heading toward the exit, their drivers wearing expressions that I now recognize as barely contained panic. The designated campground I was heading to was supposedly one of the park's most popular, yet the closer I got, the fewer vehicles I encountered. Even the wildlife seemed to be avoiding the area. With none of the usual bison or elk that Yellowstone was famous for, the dashboard electronics in my Winnebago began acting strangely as I approached my camping spot. The temperature gauge dropped rapidly despite the heater running at full blast, and the fuel indicator fluctuated wildly between empty and full. I attributed it to the RV being new, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. The campground itself was eerily empty, save for one other RV parked in the furthest spot, its windows dark and no sign of movement inside. The setting sun painted the steam from nearby geysers in unnatural colors, creating shifting patterns that drew the eye and made me dizzy if I looked too long. I chose a spot near the entrance, telling myself it was for convenience rather than admitting I wanted a quick escape route. As I went through the motions of setting up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The normal sounds of the park seemed muffled, as if something was absorbing them before they could reach my ears. My phone showed no service, which wasn't unusual for remote locations, but the complete absence of even emergency signals was unsettling. The other RV remained silent and dark, yet I could have sworn I saw curtains move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The temperature continued to drop rapidly as night approached. Far below what was forecasted for early autumn, I fired up my generator to power the heater, its familiar rumble providing little comfort in the growing darkness. The sun set with unnatural speed, plunging the campground into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow my RV's exterior lights. The steam vents surrounding the campground created shifting walls of mist that glowed faintly in my headlights, which I'd left on for comfort more than practicality. The generator's steady hum faltered for a moment, causing the lights to flicker, and in that brief instant of darkness, I saw something move in the mist. It was tall, far taller than any person should be, and its movement had an unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. When the light stabilized, there was nothing there, but the steam patterns had changed, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost like writing. A sharp knock on my RV's door nearly stopped my heart. Standing in the entranceway, I could hear the sound repeating, more insistent now, but something told me not to answer. The generator chose that moment to sputter again, and in the brief silence between its dying and restarting, I heard something else. A voice from outside, calling my name in a tone that was almost right, but not quite human. The other RV's lights suddenly blazed to life, revealing empty windows and an open door that I knew had been closed earlier. That was when I realized the knocking wasn't coming from my door at all. It was coming from underneath the RV, and it was getting louder. The knocking finally stopped around midnight, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. My generator was now running on fumes. Despite having a full tank when I arrived, the digital fuel gauge showed impossible readings, flickering between numbers that made no sense. Through the windows, I could see the steam vents had grown more active, creating a thick wall of mist that completely surrounded my RV. The temperature inside had dropped so low that I could see my breath. Even though the heater was still running, I tried the engine, thinking I could simply drive away. But it refused to turn over, making a sound I'd never heard an engine make before. The other RV had gone dark again, but now I could see condensation forming on its windows from the inside. Despite the freezing temperature, my cab radio crackled to life suddenly, emitting a series of rhythmic pulses that sounded almost like Morse code, but reversed, as if the sounds were playing backwards. I grabbed my emergency hand crank radio from the storage compartment, hoping to pick up any signal from the ranger station. Instead, I heard fragments of conversations that couldn't possibly be happening. People talking about events that hadn't happened yet, describing horrors that made me shut off the radio immediately. The mist outside had begun to take on a faint greenish glow, pulsing in sync with the sounds that had come through the radio. Movement caught my eye. Something was definitely circling my RV now. I could see its shadow through the mist, distorted and wrong, stretching impossibly tall before shrinking down to crawl beneath my vehicle. The metal floor beneath my feet vibrated with each pass it made, and I swear I could hear it tasting the air, like a snake flicking its tongue. My phone's screen lit up suddenly, showing dozens of missed calls from my own number. Each voicemail notification displayed the same timestamp, 3:33 a.m. Still hours away. I knocked the phone off the counter in panic, and when I reached to pick it up, I saw that the floor was covered in a thin layer of frost, spreading out from the center in patterns that looked like ancient symbols. The generator finally died around 2 a.m., plunging the RV into darkness and silence. Without its hum, I could hear other sounds now. The bubbling of the hot springs had taken on a rhythmic quality, like chanting in some ancient language. The steam vents were releasing plumes in synchronized bursts, creating shapes in the mist that reminded me of doorways opening and closing. The other RV's presence felt malevolent now. Like a sentinel watching my every move, I used my flashlight to check the windows, and that's when I noticed all the other tire tracks in the frost-covered ground. Dozens of them leading to where other RVs had been parked, but there were no tracks leading away. It was as if the other vehicles had simply vanished where they stood. The first scream came at 3 a.m. It sounded human, but carried across the campground for far too long without the need for breath. More voices joined it, creating a chorus that made my bones vibrate. The steam vents erupted with renewed force, and in their light I finally saw them. Shapes moving through the mist, tall and fluid, their bodies twisting in ways that defied physics. They were gathering around the other RV, their movements becoming more frenzied as 3:33 approached. My phone began ringing with calls from myself, each one accompanied by a new voicemail. Against my better judgment, I played one. What I heard was my own voice, screaming in terror, begging myself not to play the messages. Each voicemail was time-stamped 1 minute into the future, creating a cascade of warnings I was already too late to heed. Something massive moved past my window at 3:32 a.m., its surface reflecting the green glow of the mist like polished obsidian. The temperature dropped so low that the windows began to crack, frost spreading across them in those same ancient patterns I'd seen on the floor. The other RV's lights blazed to life one final time, illuminating silhouettes inside that couldn't have been human. As my watch ticked over to 3:33, every electronic device I owned activated simultaneously. Phones, tablets, the radio, even my dead generator roared to life. Through the cacophony of noise, I heard a single message repeated in my own voice. "They're coming through." The floor beneath my feet began to heat up rapidly, and I could hear the asphalt outside bubbling like the hot springs. That's when I realized the truth about Yellowstone's geothermal activity, and why the rangers were so desperate to keep people away from certain areas after dark. The ground split open at exactly 3:33 a.m., releasing a blast of scorching steam that rocked my RV on its suspension. The asphalt beneath my front tires had completely liquefied, and something was pushing its way up through the molten surface. My generator wasn't just running now. It was screaming, producing more power than should have been possible, causing every light in the RV to burn with blinding intensity. The temperature swung wildly between freezing and boiling, frost and steam fighting for dominance on my windows through the chaos. I could see the other Arv beginning to sink into the ground, its metal frame warping and twisting as if being pulled by invisible hands. The shapes in the mist had become more solid now, their obsidian surfaces reflecting the unnatural light from my Arv. They moved with purpose, forming a circle around my vehicle, their bodies stretching upward until they towered over the roof. The steam vents pulsed in sync with their movements, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made my head spin. My phone kept ringing with calls from myself, but now each voicemail was playing simultaneously, creating a deafening chorus of my own voice describing the horrors I was about to witness. The GPS screen flickered to life, showing my location as impossibly deep beneath the Earth's surface, and that's when I remembered something I'd read about Yellowstone being a supervolcano. The creatures were trying to get in now, their fluid forms probing every seam and joint of my Arv. The metal groaned under their touch, and I watched in horror as handprints appeared in the ceiling, pressing inward with increasing force. The other Arv had almost completely disappeared into the ground, but its lights were still blazing, illuminating whatever was beneath the surface. Through my cracking windshield, I could see more vehicles emerging from the liquefied asphalt. The missing RVs from the campground. Their surfaces corroded and warped as if they'd been digesting in acid. Each one still had its parking permit displayed, dating back weeks, months, even years. A massive tremor shook the entire campground, and the steam vents fell silent for one terrifying moment. In that silence, I heard something vast moving beneath the earth, and I finally understood what was really happening in Yellowstone. These creatures weren't just haunting the park. They were feeding it, using the geothermal energy to power something ancient and hungry that lived in the supervolcano's magma chamber. The missing Arvs and their occupants hadn't just disappeared. They had been processed, converted into energy to keep this thing alive. My own Arv's power systems were being hijacked now, the generator's output feeding directly into the ground beneath us. The obsidian creatures suddenly retreated from my Arv, moving back into the mist with an almost reverent slowness. The ground began to bubble and rise, forming a dome that pushed my vehicle up at an angle. Through the windshield, I could see something emerging from where the other RV had vanished. A massive shape composed of magma and darkness, its surface studded with the melted remains of countless vehicles. It rose higher and higher, steam cascading off its form, revealing a structure that resembled a massive technological hive made of volcanic glass and molten metal. My radio picked up a new transmission then, not in my voice this time, but in a chorus of all the voices that had come before me. They spoke in unison, explaining what was happening to me. Yellowstone wasn't just a supervolcano, it was an incubator, and these creatures were its caretakers. They had been here long before the park was established, using the geothermal energy to sustain their hidden civilization. The missing vehicles and their occupants were being converted into components of their expanding hive, each one adding to its technological and organic mass. My Arv was next, its modern systems particularly valuable to them. As if to demonstrate this, my generator's output suddenly quadrupled, and I felt the entire vehicle beginning to sink into the softening ground. The creatures were returning now, their obsidian forms glowing with internal heat, reaching for my Arv with appendages that looked increasingly mechanical in nature. In that moment of absolute terror, I remembered the emergency flares in my storage compartment. With trembling hands, I grabbed one and ignited it, its harsh red light filling the Rive's interior. The creatures recoiled instantly, their obsidian surfaces fracturing under the sudden burst of heat and light. My generator's scream changed pitch, becoming something close to pain, and I realized these beings couldn't handle rapid temperature changes. The massive hive structure pulsed with angry red light, its surface rippling like disturbed mercury. I had mere seconds to act before they recovered, to use this momentary weakness to save myself from becoming part of their technological graveyard. The Arv's dashboard erupted in a shower of sparks as the entities tried to reassert control over its systems. Every electronic device I owned was going haywire, screens displaying impossible patterns and emitting high-pitched whines that made my teeth ache. Through my cracked windshield, I could see more RVs rising from the liquefied ground, their metal shells partially absorbed into the hive's structure. Some still had personal belongings visible through their windows, family photos, camping gear, all the evidence of lives interrupted by these ancient horrors. The sight filled me with a rage that temporarily overcame my terror, and I knew I couldn't let myself become another silent addition to their collection. My phone rang one final time, but instead of my voice, I heard a chorus of others. Previous victims, their consciousness somehow preserved in the hive's technological matrix. They were trying to help me, fighting against their absorption into the collective. The creatures outside were becoming more mechanical now, their fluid forms solidifying into angular shapes that resembled twisted machinery. The ground beneath my RV had turned to glass, reflecting their movements like a dark mirror. I could feel them trying to merge with my vehicle's systems, attempting to transform it and me into components of their vast underground network. The heat was becoming unbearable as they tried to soften the RV's metal frame. The massive hive structure began to sink back into the ground, creating a powerful suction that pulled at my vehicle. I could see deep into the hole it emerged from, glimpsing layers of partially digested RVs and machinery stretching down into unimaginable depths. The creatures were becoming more aggressive now, their forms sprouting crystalline appendages that began cutting through my RV's outer shell. Each breach released a burst of pressurized steam, and I realized they were trying to cook me alive to prepare me for absorption into their system. The voices from my phone became more urgent, and through their electronic chaos, I understood what I needed to do. Everything in Yellowstone's geothermal system was about pressure and release. The creatures used this natural cycle to power their technology, but they relied on controlling it precisely. My RV's fuel tank was still nearly full, and the generator was running hot enough to ignite it. The voices of the previous victims guided my hands as I reached for the emergency toolkit, their combined knowledge showing me exactly where to rupture the fuel line. The creatures sensed what I was planning, their attacks becoming more frenzied. The obsidian surface of the hive structure began to crawl up the sides of my RV, trying to encase it completely before I could act. Time slowed to a crawl as I made my choice. The creatures had breached the RV's back wall, their crystalline forms refracting the flare's light into dazzling patterns. The generator was screaming at an impossible pitch, and I could feel the heat of the hive structure beginning to warp the floor beneath my feet. With a silent prayer, I triggered the fuel line rupture and struck my last flare. The voices from my phone reached a crescendo, joining together in one final effort to help me break free. The world turned white as the fuel ignited, and the last thing I heard was the sound of ancient machinery screaming in rage as their carefully maintained pressure system catastrophically failed. The explosion catapulted my RAV backward with such force that I was thrown clear through the already weakened back wall. I hit the frozen ground rolling, my ears ringing from the blast and lungs burning from the superheated air. The night sky above Yellowstone was illuminated by a massive column of steam and fire, the pressure release creating a momentary geyser that rivaled Old Faithful. Through my distorted vision, I could see the obsidian creatures writhing in agony, their crystalline forms shattering under the extreme temperature fluctuations. The hive structure was sinking rapidly back into the ground, its surface cracking and peeling like burning paint. My beloved Winnebago was a total loss, its frame twisted and burning as it slowly sank into the liquefied ground. The other absorbed RVs were being pulled down with the retreating hive, creating a grotesque whirlpool of melted metal and broken dreams. The voices in my phone had gone silent, but I swear I could feel their gratitude in the static that still crackled through its damaged speaker. The generator's final explosion had disrupted whatever power system the creatures had been building, and their carefully maintained thermal network was collapsing. Steam vents were erupting randomly across the campground, the ancient machinery beneath losing its cohesion. Dawn was approaching, but the sky remained dark with ash and steam. I could barely walk, my legs shaking from exhaustion and terror. But I knew I had to get away before the creatures could reorganize. The ground was cooling rapidly now, the glass-like surface cracking into patterns that reminded me of circuit boards. My phone's screen flickered one last time, showing a final message from the collective consciousness of previous victims, a series of coordinates and a warning about other sites across the park where these beings had established similar hives. The screen cracked and went dark, the device finally succumbing to the damage it had sustained. I stumbled toward the park entrance, looking back only once to see the campground being reclaimed by darkness. The other Arv had completely vanished, along with all evidence of the night's horrors. Only the crystalline patterns in the cooling ground suggested anything unusual had happened here. My burns were beginning to blister, and my clothes were singed and smoking. But I was alive. The same couldn't be said for countless others who had come here looking for a peaceful camping experience, only to become part of that horrific technological graveyard beneath the Earth's surface as I walked. I could still feel the echo of their voices in my mind, urging me to warn others. The ranger station was empty when I reached it, the early morning shift not yet arrived. The permit I had been issued was still in my pocket, partially melted but legible. I left it on the counter alongside a detailed warning about what I had discovered, knowing they would probably dismiss it as the ravings of a traumatized camper. The coordinates from my phone's final message were burned into my memory, and I spent the next hour using the station's computer to document everything I could remember about the experience. The Rangers would delete it. Of course, they always did. But maybe someone would see it first and think twice about camping in certain areas of Yellowstone. That's why I'm posting this warning now, from a motel hundreds of miles away from that cursed place. My body is covered in strange burns that seem to shimmer with metallic patterns in certain lights, and sometimes I still hear echoes of those voices in any electronic device I use. The creatures are still there, rebuilding their hive and waiting for the next unsuspecting Rav to park in their hunting grounds. If you're planning a trip to Yellowstone, stick to the busy tourist areas and well-lit campgrounds. And if you're in your RV at night and your generator starts acting strange, or you see strange lights in the steam vents, don't wait. Drive away as fast as you can. Those ancient beings beneath Yellowstone are always hungry, always growing, and always looking for new components to add to their eternal machine. Author's note: this document was found on a partially corrupted USB drive near Old Faithful Lodge. The drive's other contents were damaged beyond recovery, showing only fragments of coordinates and warnings about other locations throughout the park. Park authorities maintain that no RVs have been reported missing from the described campground.